Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone, and I wish you a good day of the Italian Republic. I'd like to welcome Imran RASUL. My name is Francesca PACI. I work for La Stampa daily. I work on foreign policy, especially on the Middle East, for many years, and I'm also involved with immigration. Migration has had an impact on the traditional barriers between domestic and foreign policies, become a whole sector, also in view of the fear for terrorism. Imran RASUL is a professor of economics at University College in London, and he actually does many more things. And his lecture is about justice and ethnic discrimination. Well, as a journalist, I prepared a short introduction to the slides he's going to present to us. And then, of course, you're welcome to ask questions. Talking about justice and ethnic discrimination is a monster topic, a bit like matryoshkas. It contains many other themes. It's just like a Chinese box. In order to introduce Imran RASUL's work, I've tried to use the definition given by the Investigation Commission on the Hatred Crimes, the Joe Cox Committee in Italy, and they quoted a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, we have the normalization of hostile language or hatred language towards the Muslims. At the top of the pyramid, you have the crimes and discrimination and crimes proper and felony, and then the sentences and the punishments that Imran RASUL will get into more detail. As regards the base of the pyramid, that's where I worked, especially over the last few years, starting from the Middle East to the Mediterranean, migration, so on and so forth. As regards Italy, but that applies to many other countries in the whole West, I can say. But talking about Italy, the change occurred in September 2001. At that time, the other started being identified in a more specific way. Up to then, of course, Italy had experienced the manifestations of racism and xenophobia. The Northern League as a party already existed, but the fear and the diffidence was addressed towards the Vukumpra, which is the migrants, especially coming from Northern Africa. I should ask that before 9/11, 2001, Italy was a young country in terms of immigration. The number of immigrants were not many, and actually, up to the 70s, Italy was a country of immigration, so Italians were going abroad. And starting in the mid-70s, Italy started receiving migrants from other countries. So after 9/11, 2001, whatever used to be a lack of trust and suspicion for strangers and foreigners turned into something like looking at Islam. And from that moment, fear started spreading, suspicion and control on the part of the law enforcement community. And policing was focused on mosques. And Muslims actually became the others. It doesn't mean foreigners, because after 9/11, even attacks in London and Madrid showed that the other is not necessarily a foreigner, can even be born in this country, maybe a fellow citizen, a resident, but it's a culturally and religiously other, different in terms of the way they dress, they pray, and the customs in religious and cultural terms. So the other becomes something different, other than our civilization. Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. Let me quote from this. Over and above that, there's something already present in our societies. So the change of pace, let me call it that way, happened in that moment. We perceived a threat against our civilization. At the same time, we felt legitimated to fight back. So there was a gradual acceptance of a language which actually becomes racist and discriminatory. I said acceptance because, well, before then, well, I don't mean to say that suspicion was not there, but there was a kind of prudence in a way. Italy, after the Second World War, on the ruins of racism and discrimination, racial, religious discrimination, the Shoah, had sort of turned certain words and certain language into taboos. And then the booming economy in Europe with globalization, the idea we all belong to a global village. And that, of course, led to an excessively politically correct language. But we had to coexist and accept one another. That was the model. But the fear for Islam threatening our civilization and asking for self-defense and fighting back actually authorized the use of a language that up to them was not tolerated and people were actually ashamed of. Or up to the actual racism and xenophobia, because confrontation with Islam changed the rules of the game. It was no longer about race or blood, but it's apparently something more noble: culture, civilization, religion, and the West at large. And acceptance occurred at all levels, because these themes were not only promoted by the right or the extreme right, but in the wake of the perceived threat of Islam, they were taken over by the left, like in France. Of course, Islam is a religion threatening the conquest of a liberal left. Or just think, when I worked on that for the first time, I was really surprised, but I thought it made sense. Imagine Marine Le Pen in France, and around her, little by little, an aggregation developed of the French homosexual community in the wake of the fear of Islam. I mean, for Islam to attack the French laïcité, the secularism, the typical French secularism. This was not just limited to Europe. It happened in the United States, and RASUL will talk about it. Think of Trump just banning some countries just because they were Muslim, not because they had ever attacked the United States in any way. And we're coming to the second level of the pyramid, switching from language to crimes, hatred crimes, and discrimination proper. Let me just mention, to give an idea, figures don't tell the whole story, but they can give you an idea. The data of the Racial Anti-Discrimination Office with OECD showed that in Italy in 2016, out of 2,000 discrimination actions, 65% were for racial discrimination. In 2015, out of 155 hatred crimes, 369 were linked to xenophobia, about 50%. And that led to an increase in the number of court cases. Of the last 3 years, appeal courts in Italy saw an increase of reports of crimes for Rome, 100, in Bologna, 157, in Milan over 130, in Catania, 14, Bari, 7. And the South, in spite of its contradictions and problems, seems to be stronger in this sense. So coming to the recent years and the economic crunch crisis, 2007-8, which actually made the middle class poorer. And when you get poorer, of course, people start being afraid and feeling scared. They have to look for a scapegoat. And that scapegoat was already there, because at that point, it was no longer Muslims. Migrants were coming in, but there was a widespread acceptance of scapegoating other people without having to justify, to account for it as politically correct. And from this viewpoint, just think of Italian news. Last year in 2017, at the beginning of the year, support for the law of second-generation immigrants in Italy was about 60%. Italians were not against it. At the end of last year, after a long electoral campaign until March the 4th, the consensus had dropped to half of that. Just think of the Italian electoral campaign that was played on that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's a fact. It was actually played absolutely on fear for migrants and in the invasion of migrants, while we're talking about 190,000 people coming to this country. So in theory, these numbers wouldn't justify such a fear for an invasion, especially in a situation where official data shows that crimes in Italy of all kinds have been declining for the last 20 years. And we've reached the lowest point since the unification of Italy. And the real perceived context doesn't always match this data. So 9/11 was a cornerstone, really the way we get controlled, we move, we feel things. But the politically correct approach has been set aside, and language has no limitations in calling other people enemies and different. And then the credit crunch and the economic crisis came along, and we felt justified in behaving that way. The media have actually been riding this wave and this perception of a correlation between migration and the other, the Muslim, the refugee, the migrant, potentially the author of terrorist attacks. But in Italy, we've had no such attacks. So these people were actually identified as low-skills people, taking jobs away from Italians. So a different kind of threat that was accepted by the media and diffused by the media, because of course that made declining audiences on the radio and TV, led to a situation where you try to attract audience back, even with fake news. If you remember, the year before the Weinstein's case was full of reports in Hollywood of Middle Eastern actors that were fed up with being hired only to play the roles of kamikaze or terrorists and so on and so forth. So let me come to my conclusions, and then I'll give the floor to Imran RASUL. This, of course, leads to more reports, more controls, more law enforcement activities, more policing. That's a vicious circle that develops. And we should actually count the number of migrants in Italian prisons, because that turns into an electoral door opener. In European jails, foreigners are about 21%. In Italy, 32%, because in our law, we criminalize irregular or illegal migrants, even if they have committed no crime. But regular, legal migrants, be they Muslims or not, are a very limited percentage, accounting for only 10% of the foreign inmates and 3% of the total. So there are less of them in jail than Italians, but that's just numbers. The perception is different, and you tend to correlate the crime and the other as a person. So it's very hard getting rid of this perception. Last point, preventive incarceration is more easily applied to foreigners or migrants than Italy. And then, of course, taking us back to 9/11, suspicion, what to do, there's been a tightening of rules. The percentage of foreigners in preventive incarceration on total number of sentences is 28% versus 31% in total. So preventive incarceration is more frequently applied to migrants or foreigners than Italians. So that's sort of catch-22 situation. There's a reason why we've come to this point, and we've come to the slides that Imran RASUL is about to show us, and it's the spirit of our times as well. Just think of the new government that's just been inaugurated. The first theme tackled by the new Home Minister was reducing spending for migrants, and this is not just a result of an electoral campaign, but it's actually the most popular thing to do and the least expensive, actually. So it's easier to cut these expenses. An important area to be tackled by politicians and the media as well. This is also fueled by the internet and the social media. Well, the internet and social media, beware, they're just megaphones, loudspeakers of something already there in the guts of people, and it's worth thinking about. Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Imran RASUL.
Thank you, Francesca, for the very insightful introduction. And let me just start by saying it's a pleasure to be here and be able to present some of my work today, which is examining behavior in the criminal justice system in the United States. So this is a country which is very much built on immigration and is probably one of the most culturally and ethnically diverse countries on the planet. But what I want to understand today and to present to you is some work relating to behavior by very senior judges in the criminal justice system in the United States. So before doing so, I want to just put the US criminal justice system into context and just to give you some statistics about how this system delivers outcomes. So the first statistic I wanted to present to you is just to show you that the United States incarcerates more individuals as a share of its population than any other country on the planet. Let me start by showing you the figures for a range of different OECD countries. And you can think of this as the share of the population currently in prison or in some detention center. So the US incarcerates more individuals than any other country on the planet. The US is obviously the top country shown in the figure. I've also highlighted Italy towards the bottom of the figure, which as a share of its population has about 1/5 the likelihood of somebody being in prison than in the United States. The UK is more similar to Italy than to the United States. In fact, that means that about 1/4 of the people on the planet who are currently behind bars are in the United States, whereas the US only has 5% of the world's population. Okay, so this is a very, very extreme system on that dimension. And of course, I'm going to focus my discussion today on men. The vast majority of prisoners in most countries are men. What I want to focus in particular is how men from certain minorities are much more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system than the native white population. Okay, so although there are very extreme levels of incarceration, they're actually very different for different ethnic groups in the United States. So, for example, we have some fairly shocking statistics by different ethnic groups. So currently, about 1 in 9 black men, that's almost 10% of the population of black men aged between 20 and 34, are currently in prison. If we think about the share of men who expect to be imprisoned at some point in their adult lives, that's 1 in 3 black men. However, it's been less recognized that Hispanics are actually the fastest group being incarcerated in the US. And currently, in the most senior level of the criminal justice system that I'll be examining today, about 40% of prisoners are of Hispanic origin. And so relative to white individuals, Hispanic men are 4 times as likely to go to federal prison at some point in their lives as white individuals. Okay, and what I would really like to try to understand in this research agenda is to understand what's driving these differences. Is this down to discrimination of different legal actors, either the police, judges, prosecutors, or is there some other explanation that is actually relevant for us to understand? It might not all be a matter of discrimination. Obviously, these huge differences between the way that different races and ethnic groups come into contact with the criminal justice system has huge impacts beyond just the impacts in terms of prison. So, for example, if individuals anticipate that they're going to be incarcerated or come into contact with the police, this has been shown to affect children's behavior, say in schools, or young adults' incentives to acquire skills because they don't think they're necessarily going to be able to use those skills in the labor market. These types of experiences with the criminal justice system have also been shown to have pretty devastating effects on marriage markets amongst different minority groups, where you have a huge absence of men of marriageable age or men who have young children. So we can expect this to have impacts on families, on children going forward into future generations. And obviously for the individuals themselves, these rates of incarceration will then have impacts in terms of their ability to come back into society, to contribute, say, through their labor market earnings and activities. So there are a whole variety of reasons why we should care to understand what causes these big differences. But what I want to also emphasize is that the US criminal justice system is also incredibly severe in terms of the penalties that it provides. So of individuals who come up in front of judges, 90% of them go to prison. Very few people are found not guilty or given a non-custodial sentence. In terms of the average amount of time that individuals spend in prison, this is for the federal criminal justice system. This is the highest tier of the US system, just below the Supreme Court. On average, for whites who go to prison, they go to prison for about 41 months. The average black male goes to prison for 83 months, more than double. And Hispanic individuals go to prison for about 42 months, quite comparable to whites. However, from an economic point of view, what we'd really like to try to understand is if we compare like-for-like individuals, if we imagine 2 individuals who've committed identically the same offense at the same moment in time, they have the same quality of legal counsel, they have the same age, they have identical criminal histories, they have the same marital status, same number of dependents, and they're being tried in a very similar court. If we compare 2 individuals who are identical in all of those dimensions, the only difference is their ethnicity, then we can say, well, what are the differences, the conditional differences in how the criminal justice system is treating them? And that's what's shown in the figure in the bottom right-hand corner. So for 2 individuals that have identically the same characteristics, so we're really making a like-for-like comparison, then what we observe is that a black male, when they go to prison, they're sentenced for 4 months longer than a white individual, and Hispanic individuals are also sentenced between 4 and 5 months longer for identically the same offense and all those other like-for-like comparisons than a white individual. So the key question that we're trying to understand is whether these differences for 2 otherwise identical individuals is driven by discrimination or it's driven by some other factor, whether judges observe something about these individuals that might justify these differences. So in order to understand whether those differences are driven by discrimination or something else, we consider how judges change their behavior around 9/11. Okay, so we're going to think about 9/11 as being a very large shock to the US sort of cultural setup. It's an event that was going to be unanticipated, and without doubt it's been documented by a range of human rights organizations and academics that 9/11 caused an increase in animosity that individuals felt towards Muslims. The figure there just shows you what happened to hate crime towards Muslims, the types of crime that Francesca mentioned in her introduction. And we see a spike in 2001, that there was increased animosity, increased aggression that we can measure statistically. It doesn't just come from media reports. This is as documented in FBI data. So without doubt, 9/11, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, created animosity, increased animosity towards Muslims in the US. What we want to try to understand in our research is whether that has impacts on non-Muslim minorities within the federal criminal justice system. In particular, are sentencing outcomes for blacks and Hispanics impacted by this increased animosity towards one other minority group? Okay, so what we're trying to understand is whether animosity towards one minority group then impacts outcomes for other minority groups. Okay, why might there be such interlinkages between how we as a society feel towards one particular minority group and how senior judges then treat other minority groups? And here there are well-known theories from psychology to suggest that how we think about one minority group can have such spillover or interlinkage effects on how we then treat other minority groups. Francesca alluded to this in her introduction when she contrasted immigrants and terrorists and how these two issues typically get conflated in public debate and in the minds of individuals. And so in psychology, we have very well-established theories. One such theory is what's known as contagious animosity, that says if you feel more animosity towards one particular group, then that can potentially cause you to have more uncontrolled or subconscious feelings of animosity towards other minority groups. What we want to try to understand is when there's a spike in animosity just after 9/11 towards Muslims, whether that then impacts the way that very senior judges are then treating other minority groups who happen to be in the criminal justice system at the same moment in time. Okay. And in particular, we might think that Hispanic defendants are more impacted by these interlinkages with Muslims than for other minority groups for a whole variety of different explanations that I want to now come to. So the first is political rhetoric. Here I've given a quote from a senior US politician just after 9/11, which makes clear that in the minds of politicians, in the minds of the media, and potentially therefore in the minds of the general public, there is a linkage between immigration policies and our vulnerability to terrorist activities. This is despite the fact that all of the individuals involved in the 9/11 atrocity actually all entered the US legally. This is a very stark quote, but as Francesca alluded to in her introduction, these types of interlinkage between a fear of Muslims, a fear of terrorism, is often very closely intertwined with language and debate around immigration. And I've just highlighted sort of the most recent sort of form in which this is taken, which is sort of the proposals by Donald Trump to build his wall along the southern border. So that's the first dimension in terms of political rhetoric. The second dimension is in terms of policy. So even before 9/11, in fact, in the immediate aftermath of the Oklahoma terrorist attacks, various pieces of legislation were passed in the US, which again increased the interlinkage between crimes related to immigration and crimes related to terrorism. So that leads individuals who are involved in the criminal justice system, from legal advisors, judges and other key individuals, to have in their mind, in the background, these important linkages between these somewhat different spheres of policy. And here I've given another particular quote from the Attorney General in the US at the time, again making explicit this linkage. But this process started actually well before 9/11 in response to the Oklahoma terrorist attack in 1995. And the third key dimension that causes terrorist and immigration offenses to become interlinked is the creation of institutions. Okay, so subsequent to this period, what we observe is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which is the first time in US history that the same government agency is responsible for protecting the homeland and at the same time also dealing with immigration policy, Traditionally, immigration policy was actually housed within the Department of Labor in the US, but in the wake of terrorist attacks, these policies actually became implemented and housed within the same federal agency, the Department for Homeland Security. And again, that strengthens the narrative between concerns over terrorist attacks and fears over immigration. And it's through those three dimensions of interlinkage that we might think that potentially individuals and judges may be influenced in how they then treat Hispanic individuals in the wake of 9/11, which was very much a terrorist event. To set the scene for that potential possibility, what I want to show you is, again, some statistics, all from before 9/11, about sentiment that individuals felt towards different minority groups in the US. This is taken from a nationally representative sample collected by political scientists, and these statistics are referred to as thermometer readings. So in order to derive these statistics, we take individuals in society and we ask them, how much affinity do you feel towards certain groups? Towards whites, towards Hispanics, blacks, towards feminists, towards environmentalists. We have a whole sequence of different groups. And then from that, we can construct a measure which is known as our sort of thermometer reading, which is how the average white individual in the US, how much affinity or animosity do they feel towards other groups. So here I'm just going to show you those statistics, all from before 9/11. These statistics are actually calculated in 2000. So you can see for whites, everything is normalized by whites, so whites feel zero affinity towards themselves. So in terms of the elderly, they're the group who are most favored in terms of a minority group in the US in 2000. And then for the other groups, you can see increasing degrees of animosity felt by whites towards these other minority groups. This is something that surprised me, but there's actually more animosity towards Hispanics on the eve of 9/11 than there is towards blacks. It's not as bad as the animosity felt towards gays and lesbians, people on welfare, or Christian fundamentalists. But in terms of differences between ethnic groups, Hispanics have more animosity, they have lower thermometer readings than blacks. And this statistic is replicated going back to the 1970s, actually. So this is amongst the average population. What we want to understand is, are very senior and professional judges also influenced by these types of feeling of animosity around 9/11? Okay. For the average citizen, we see that immediately after 9/11, there start to be changes in people's perception. So the left-hand side figure shows you data from Gallup before and after 9/11, showing you how people's views about whether they think immigration should be restricted. And if you look at the light blue line, that shows the share of respondents to this Gallup poll over time that think that immigration should be decreased. And around 9/11, the vertical dash line there, you see a big jump up in the share of individuals who think that immigration should now be restricted in some way. The right-hand side figure shows you crimes of vandalism then committed against different ethnic groups in the US, where the blue line shows you crimes committed against Hispanic individuals. And so we see a spike in that vulnerability to crimes of vandalism, for example, immediately after 9/11. So this all seems to suggest that animosity increased, not just towards Muslims, but also towards immigrants and potentially Hispanics immediately after 9/11. Does this feed through into how people are treated in the criminal justice system? So as I've mentioned, we're going to study this question in the federal criminal justice system. This is the highest tier of the American judiciary. This is above the state levels. It's only one level below the Supreme Court. This is a very high-stakes professional environment. We have very senior judges who are appointed for life by the president to this tier of the judiciary. At any one moment in time, there are only around 700 federal judges who are operating. That's the degree of selection that we have of very high-quality individuals. And they're operating in a system in which sentencing guidelines are in place. So the discretion that judges have is somewhat limited and should only be determined by the severity of the offense that's been committed and a defendant's criminal history. So let me just describe a little bit the system that the judges are operating in, so then we can see how they might change their behavior. So this is an indication of the sentencing guideline. So at any moment in time, when I observe a case, a judge has to be told what is the offence level of that individual, and the offence is categorized from level 1 to level 43. There's a lot of variation in offence levels, where level 43 are the most serious offences, level 1 are the least serious offences. And at the same time, a defendant is characterized by their criminal history, how frequently they've been in prison in the past, how long they've been to prison for. And again, we have a system where we can define an individual at the time when they come up before the judge in terms of 6 different levels of criminal history, where you can range from group 1 up to group 6. Okay? And so for any given combination, if an individual has an offence level of severity 22 and their criminal history is group 4, then the judge is typically required to sentence them to prison for between 63 and 78 months. The system doesn't allow judges much discretion, and this system was put in place in the US to exactly try to prevent discrimination from judges by saying, you take this information as given, the discretion that you have is where in this boundary between 63 and 78 months you're going to sentence an individual. However, judges do have one level of discretion, which is to say, I actually disagree with the offence level and the criminal history that's been presented to me by the legal teams. And so a judge has the possibility to assign somebody to a slightly lower cell. So in this case, it may be the case that an individual, instead of being assigned to 63 to 78 months, the judge says, actually, the offence is not as severe, their criminal history is not as severe, and they should actually be assigned to 21 to 27 months. That's the main decision that judges have in this system, and this is what is known as the ability to downwards depart. For white individuals, in 17% of cases, we observe downwards departures. What I want to understand is how does that change for Hispanics and for blacks just after 9/11? Okay, so what we observe in our administrative records, we observe individuals from the point they're arrested by the police as they work through all different stages of the criminal justice system, including the trial and the actual sentencing by the judge. What we're going to do is take a set of defendants, all of whom committed their offences well before 9/11. Okay, all of the individuals committed their offences before 9/11, but then they're working through the timeline. So we have a set of individuals whose sentencing by the judge occurs just before 9/11. And we're going to compare outcomes for those individuals who were sentenced just before 9/11 to another set of individuals who also committed their offences before 9/11, but happened to be sentenced just after 9/11. Their trial had already taken place, their guilty verdict had already been given. The only thing that needed to be determined by the judge was what was going to be their sentence. Okay? So they're the two groups we'll be comparing, and we want to see whether people are treated differently after 9/11 than before 9/11, and whether that is different for black individuals or for Hispanics. This is what we find. Remember, the baseline level of downwards departures is 17%. In 17% of cases, judges for whites normally say we're going to downwards depart and give this individual a less severe sentence than the prosecution have asked for. What we observe is, for those decisions made just after 9/11, we find that blacks actually become 1 percentage point less likely to receive a downwards departure, but for Hispanics, they're actually more than 3.5% less likely to receive a downwards departure. So we start from a baseline of 17%, that falls now, and they're only 13% as likely to receive a downwards departure. And these numbers are for like comparisons. These are comparing a Hispanic defendant and a white defendant who've committed exactly the same offence. They should have been assigned with the same criminal history and the same offence severity. They have the same age, the same marital background, the same number of children, and they're being sentenced in the same court. Okay, these two individuals are identical as far as we can observe. The only difference between them is their ethnicity. Okay? And despite being sentenced in a very similar time period, after 9/11, we're seeing big reductions in the likelihood that these senior judges are granting downward departures to Hispanic defendants. Okay? This applies both to Hispanic individuals who have US citizenship and also Hispanic individuals who don't have US citizenship. The numbers are 3% for Hispanic citizens and more than 4% reductions in downward departures for non-citizens. In terms of crimes, we see the biggest reductions in the likelihood of downward departures amongst Hispanic citizens to be for immigration offences, but there's also a 3% reduction for Hispanics who've committed other offences, which are not related to drugs but are often related to gun crime. Okay, so the effects are not just concentrated amongst US citizen Hispanics. The effects are not concentrated just amongst immigration offences. It's across the board, and both for US citizen Hispanics and for non-US citizen Hispanics. When we translate these reductions in judges' downwards departures into how much longer individuals then spend in prison, we observe for Hispanics, before 9/11, they were spending about 4 months longer in prison than white individuals. Remember, that was the like-for-like comparison I started out with. After 9/11, they spend almost 5 months longer in prison. Okay, so this is an additional month that they spend in prison for two otherwise identical individuals. And this is costly. This is costly to send people to prison for these types of difficult to explain reasons. So we can think about the cost of this either to society. So we know how much it costs taxpayers, how much it costs society to keep somebody in prison for 1 month longer. That corresponds to $29,000 to keep somebody in prison for an additional year. So to keep them in prison for an additional month is about $1,500 per defendant we have to spend. That aggregates to a lot, given that 40% of all defendants are Hispanics and 25% of the world's prisoners are in the US. In addition, the individual will also bear some costs of going to prison for longer in terms of their future lives when they come out of prison, the lack of opportunities that they might then have from having been in prison for longer. And that's been estimated for an individual to be between $36,000 and $40,000 US dollars over the course of their lives. This is hugely costly. If you just try to translate this into monetary terms, you can translate it into other terms as well in terms of lost opportunities for these individuals. So it really makes a difference to these individuals. It makes a huge difference to society as a whole. And just to start to conclude, the results are somewhat different across different parts of the United States. So here what I've shown you is a map of the United States where each square there, each region corresponds to a different federal court. So there are 90 federal courts in the United States. The darker areas are those areas that have the highest likelihood that Hispanics are downwards departed. And the lighter areas are where Hispanics are being dealt with more harshly after 9/11. And when you try to understand the characteristics of these areas, one key characteristic where Hispanics are being treated less harshly after 9/11 is where there are more Hispanic judges at this very senior level. Okay, so that seems to suggest that the ethnicity of the judge also matters for what happens to defendants based on the defendant's ethnicity. And that again seems to suggest this may be acts of discrimination rather than any differences that can be justified from a legal or economic point of view. Let me just conclude. So what we've observed is that 9/11, an event that was unanticipated and very much related to terrorist activities, did have spillover effects for other minorities in the United States. There are these types of contagious animosity where if we feel anger and increasing distrust towards some groups, that causes us to change our behavior towards other minority groups. What we're observing is that these types of potentially subconscious changes in individuals' behavior apply to very senior judges. They apply to highly skilled judges. Remember, there are only 700 of these judges in the entire United States. This is a very, very select group of individuals, and these types of biases almost, also seem to apply at this very high level. So if they apply at this level, for certain, they're likely to apply for other individuals. They're in me, they're in you. These things will happen at all different tiers of the criminal justice system. But the paper does suggest some policies that we can have to try to mitigate these types of implicit bias. From an economic point of view, we can think of three different dimensions from what can we do to try to mitigate these types of bias that lead to unfair, unjust outcomes, which is essentially, eroding the basis on which any justice system is based. The first might be to try to train judges, to make individuals aware of the implicit biases that they have. A second dimension might be to monitor judges, for us to say that judges need to justify to a greater extent why they're making decisions related to downwards departure. So potentially trying to monitor judges to a greater extent might have an impact on their behavior. And the third dimension that economists think of is in terms of selection. Can we change the composition of the judiciary? Are there policies that we can put in place to encourage more individuals from minority backgrounds to potentially enter into these occupations and to remain there? To come back to the overall themes of the festival, though, there is an important notion here that what we're documenting here are essentially implicit biases that individuals might have. They may not be aware that they're changing their behavior in this way. We can discover these biases statistically, but individuals may not be conscious that they're making these decisions. And so there's a larger question to be had among society, and economists and lawyers have something to contribute to this, which is the extent to which we might want to have automation in different parts of the criminal justice system. We're already seeing this at the very first point where people come into contact with the criminal justice system. So we've gone from what used to be science fiction in terms of Robocop or predictive policing to the right-hand side of the figure, where these types of algorithms, where these types of predictive policing notions are actually being constructed and currently being used to inform the police where should they deploy their resources at any given moment in time. Often we observe very predictable patterns of crime, when crime occurs, where it occurs, in relation to all kinds of characteristics of a neighborhood. Fundamental question that we're then pushing towards in this paper, in this agenda, is should we then try to automate other forms of decision-making in the criminal justice system? Is it good to try to remove human biases, or will it be the case that we introduce other forms of bias as we remove human interaction in these types of systems and try to move towards more automated systems? The sentencing guidelines were a step in that direction. They were explicitly designed to reduce the discretion that judges had. And we see that that system actually didn't prevent discrimination taking place when judges are basing their decisions on somewhat emotional factors related to 9/11. So it's an open question, but I think economists, lawyers, and the general public all have important things to decide and debate upon. There will be costs and benefits of making those moves. Hopefully our research can be useful to thinking about some of the issues that are at play there. Okay, thank you.
Grazie molto.
Thank you very much to Imran RASUL. We can now open it to the floor. The Q&A session is open now, especially starting from the last point you raised, a question with no answer, basically. So can automating policing contribute to correcting bias, or can it have only a limiting, distorting impact? Because we're talking about automation and AI at a time in which probably Western societies show behaviors that are very far away from your algorithm about predictability. While you were talking, I was thinking about the figures on imprisonment and costs that have to be borne by keeping a person 1 month longer in jail for reasons due to an implicit bias and not the level of crime that was committed. When talking about data on immigrant invasion, like in 190,000 people and so on. But in Western societies, in Italy, in the US, in sociology, there is only one theorem, the Thomas theorem, stating if men perceive and define something as real, the consequences of that will be real too. And that's the very opposite of rationality. So I'd like to take some questions from you. Well, otherwise I'll ask myself. There's a question over there. Please use a microphone for translation. Thank you very much. I have two short questions. The first, can you please tell us what the percentage of non-white judges is, or non-Anglo-Saxon judges in the federal courts? And the second question is, what's your opinion about the fact that our judiciary is selected by public competition? So they're not appointed, they are not chosen by voters. So do you think this difference has an impact because our system is generally considered as a more balanced system? Do you think this might be the cause of the consequences that you outlined? I hope I've been clear enough.
We'll collect different questions.
Ce ne sono altre? Vogliamo... Ok.
We'll take a few more questions before you reply. Is that okay for you?
I just wanted to ask how the kind of like, if, you know, when a Hispanic non-citizen has entered the country and been, you know, and then they've got a sentencing and they've already committed a crime by entering the country. So I was just wondering whether the fact that by the time they've already, you know, reached a judge, they've already been guilty of another crime, does this have any impact, or is there such, you know, if you've committed a crime before, does that make the judge more discriminate or more harsher to you when you sentence again? Thank you.
Ce n'è un'altra per caso? No, allora intanto andiamo.
Okay, so just to go through those in sequence, there's about 14% of judges in the US who are from non-white backgrounds, and they tend to be concentrated in certain federal courts, and it's in those federal courts that we find the discrimination against Hispanics to actually be the least. So that suggests that the ethnicity of judges also matters for how defendants are treated, leading us to think that this might be discrimination. This is not just something that judges have been, in general, are practicing. The question of how we select judges, and clearly different countries have different mechanisms, whether it's through public appointment, lifetime appointments, or electoral appointees. And so here we know a little bit about how individuals behave. The incentives that individuals have will be different, who is willing to stand in those different systems, and how their behavior might be impacted depending on what they think is going to happen in the future. Are they going to be reappointed? Are the voters are actually going to reappoint them? And we see this in the US in terms of regulators. Some regulators for some industries were electorally appointed. Some of them are appointed by politicians directly. The US system is designed to give politicians absolutely no say in, or voters no say in trying to discipline these federal judges. They're appointed by presidents, they have to be approved by Congress, but they're also appointed for life. So they face no re-election or chances to actually be kicked out for bad decisions. So this is a system in which, compared to most other judges in the US, these individuals are highly skilled, highly trained. We do find some additional differences beyond the ethnicity of the judge in driving outcomes, such as whether they've been appointed by a Democrat or by a Republican, and also the experience that they have of seeing other cases. So clearly there are some factors that potentially we could manipulate amongst judges and see, can we appoint them differentially. The fundamental difficulty here is that I think what we're measuring here are essentially implicit biases that judges and individuals have. When we have an event like 9/11, it triggers first and foremost an emotional response. And that's very hard for us to try to suppress. And perhaps if we do try to suppress that, we might overcompensate and lead to worse outcomes for other individuals. And so that's why it makes it a fundamentally difficult question to think about, can we improve on this system, or do we have to accept these differences? If we have full automation, no doubt we will have other errors that creep into the system. And because ultimately those algorithms will be designed by humans and they will feed in as has been documented. So I think that there are important trade-offs for us to think about. But what really surprised us is, we find such important levels of discrimination, even amongst this very select group of professional judges. In terms of how do the results vary depending on the criminal history of the defendant, all of the individuals that we consider have been found guilty. The only thing that remains to be determined is the sentence that they're then given. So here we're really comparing like with like of individuals who potentially, for example, could have been deported. And that's true both before 9/11, that hasn't changed policy-wise after 9/11. So these impacts that we're finding are really essentially for two clones. One that happened to be sentenced before 9/11, one after 9/11, where they also differ in terms of they were a pair of white clones versus a pair of Hispanic clones. So these impacts are really coming from something related to them being Hispanic and being treated differently after 9/11. And it's not down to where they're being treated, their criminal histories, the level of the offence severity, or anything else that determines where they end up in that guideline cell table.
Ci sono altre domande? Allora, mentre magari...
Well, while you're thinking, I have two questions myself. The first question is more of a journalistic question, I can say. It comes to mind that you said that this contagious animosity after 9/11, this lack of trust towards the Muslims in general, had an impact on criminal justice, more on the Hispanic community than the black community, which, well, in a way, was more likely to have links with the Muslim community, being black and Muslim. So we have followed the Black Lives Matter movement, which was focusing on this very issue. I was reading today that a family of a black guy that had been killed by police had received compensation of $4 because the gun was not loaded and stuff. So how comes there was no movement called the Spanish or Hispanic Lives Matter? What do you think? There's more of an acceptance, more fear, or what? This is my first question. Second question, the phenomenon that you described, this suspicion and lack of trust, this going from the Muslims to other individuals after 9/11, and that actually happened in this country as well. As I explained, you focused on the United States, but my impression is that it happened in Italy too. Do you think this is something that the whole West has in common? Do you think it affects other countries too? I'm talking about the West because the debate on discrimination in legal terms is more lively, luckily.
Okay, so the issue of discrimination against blacks in the US criminal system is obviously one that is highly relevant and one that gets a lot of attention in the US and outside. Clearly, our statistics show that there are important differentials in how black defendants are being treated before 9/11 relative to whites. What our results show is, though, that those levels of differences don't change because of 9/11. That's not to say that there aren't differences, that there aren't important differences, and they might be down to discrimination. What our results show is that those don't change with 9/11. 9/11 particularly triggers animosity towards Muslims that then spills over onto Hispanics rather than onto blacks. In fact, all of our results seem to suggest that there's absolutely no impact on black defendants at all as a result of 9/11. But an interesting question is, why does a movement like Hispanic Lives Matter also not exist or get the same levels of attention? I think as Hispanics, become more prominent in US society on a whole range of different dimensions, that inevitably will be something that that society will have to confront and recognize that there are those differences. I showed you the statistics in terms of the thermometer readings before 9/11, and it was surprising, but the degrees of animosity felt towards Hispanics were higher than felt towards blacks, and that's been the case since the 1970s, since the data first started to be collected. So this is very much a deep-rooted animosity that's felt. And this is actually something that Huntington has actually described in his work as well. You alluded to Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations. He often refers to Latinos as well as Muslims as permanently being regarded as outsiders in US society. It's a different form of discrimination than potentially that might be against blacks. It's a different dimension of emotional response. It's something that, probably as social scientists, we're still trying to understand what triggers these different factors, how do we perceive different minority groups, and what are the linkages between these different minority groups. There's a range of different evidence collected by psychologists, both in terms of lab environments and sort of in real-world environments, where I could separate this room into two groups and tell this group something about this group and this group something about this group and engender some kind of animosity between the two halves of the room. I can just give you a false label, and a very natural reaction for us is to identify more to the group that we've been assigned to than the group that we see ourselves in opposition to. This is just a trait that we seem to have and has been documented by many different disciplines, both in the natural sciences and the social sciences. And I can engender this on a purely artificial characteristic. I can call this group the left group, this group the right group. So it's hard to understand how can we try to offset these, but they're there in everybody. And here what we're trying to do is use economic statistical techniques to try to uncover that, to try to measure the impact of that, and try to suggest some ways to potentially offset those factors. But I think it's very much the case that these types of behaviors therefore would exist in other societies and other criminal justice systems, irrespective of how we try to select individuals either into the police, into prosecution, into the judiciary. There's always going to be these types of factors. Currently, I'm working with the Ministry of Justice in the UK to try to replicate this analysis for the UK around terrorist events in the UK, and to try to understand whether something similar is happening there, potentially against other groups beyond Muslims as well. There's been other studies conducted in France, for example, that use very detailed and similar data to show that the sentences handed out by French judges are very much influenced by what's prominent in the media at the time. So if there are very high-profile cases in some particular part of the country about some particular type of crime, that then impacts other defendants who've got nothing to do with that in terms of how judges behave. Potentially, you could imagine those issues being magnified in a system where judges are being held to account by voters and by potential electoral arguments. And in Italy, similar results have been shown in terms of how the criminal justice system impacts minority groups in terms of immigrants in particular, that when, for example, it becomes easier for immigrants to obtain citizenship, then you see criminality by immigrants plummeting. That essentially it's not a choice, it's something that they may well be forced to do. And small changes in how the legal system treats individuals can have big impacts in terms of their behavior. And that's what I alluded to at the start of the talk when I mentioned that the fact that individuals are going to come into contact with the criminal justice system at the most important time in their lives, when they're young adults and just making so many important decisions, has impacts not just on their lives after that, but has impacts on their lives before that age, when they're making choices or their parents are making choices about education and the skills that these individuals will have. So these are important challenges, not just for lawyers or for economists working on crime, but for individuals who are working on education, working on families, working on labour markets. Essentially, the whole of our lives we're going to be impacted by how we're treated by the system. And when we have such big differences, we can expect big differences in outcomes along all of those dimensions that are not unique to the US.
Ci sono altre domande?
Is there any other question? Yes, there is one question.
From the United States. So my question is, the level of criminality, judges, everything, is just the volume is much higher at the state level than at the federal level. And I would expect your statistics would look even worse if you looked at the state level. So I guess my specific question is, I can speculate to myself on why you restricted your study to the federal level. Maybe it's because that's where most of the terrorism-related crimes exist. But have you thought about taking the next step to the lower courts, the state level? Because I think the results could possibly be much worse.
C'è qualcun altro?
Any other question?
Important to try to look at other actors in the judiciary. Importantly, the state level, as you mentioned, as well as potentially changes in behaviour of the police. In our current work, we focus on the federal system essentially because that's where we expect the most professional judges to be present. So we're thinking this is the worst place to try to find evidence of discrimination. So let's start there and try to have the best case scenario. And if we find something there, that's important because of the severity of offences here, but also it probably will be indicative of exactly the intuition that you said, that things are worse at other parts of the justice system. We look at the federal system, though, not just because of the severity, but also because it's very algorithmic in terms of how long those different stages of the system take. So it's very easy to see individuals who come up just before 9/11 versus after 9/11. If we start looking at the state level, there's many more margins of discretion in terms of how speedily you put somebody through the system, and that varies state by state. So it becomes much more challenging statistically to show convincing like-for-like comparisons at that level because there's many more sources of discrimination. We might try to get to that when we look at the UK system, for example, where one thing that you can do is speed people through the system, and that may be another margin along which people are being discriminated against. But that's a much more complicated statistical problem to deal with as well. That's why we've started here. But my sense is that in other parts of the system, whether we're thinking about the police or the state level or other countries, as soon as you have more flexibility for agents to behave in this way, things will potentially multiply along different margins. Here we've looked at judges who are essentially quite restricted. They just have one decision that they can make on downwards departures, and that's where we're able to focus our attention. But I would love to be able to come back in a few years' time and show additional results for other parts of the judiciary. And that's going to help us understand both where it's worse, but also maybe where it doesn't exist. And are there important lessons that we can learn from those parts of the criminal justice system as well?
Ci sono altre domande? Credo che se non ci sono...
Any other question? Well, if not, then I think we can draw to a close, and thank you very, very much, Mr. Imran RASUL. And of course, we thank you all for your attention and the questions you asked. Thank you.